He's on murals from Argentina to Amsterdam. His silhouette sells everything from coffee mugs to protest slogans, but most people wearing his image have no idea who he really was. Ernesto Che Guevara is one of the most recognized political icons of the 20th century, a symbol of defiance, rebellion, and revolution. His image with the wild hair and the intense eyes under that starred beret has become visual shorthand for fighting the system. But what did he actually stand for? Was he a noble fighter for the oppressed, or was he just another man driven by obsession, ideology, and at times brutality? This is not a story of a saint, nor is it the story of a villain. It's the story of a boy born into privilege who chose poverty, of a man trained to heal who chose to kill, of someone who abandoned comfort for conviction, of Che Guevara, the doctor, the revolutionary, the myth, and the man behind it all. Before the bullets and the jungles, before the executions and the iconography, there was just a sick child gasping for air lying on a cold floor in Argentina. And from that moment, everything that followed became an act of will, an attempt to dominate his body, the world, and history itself. If you think you know Che Guevara, think again. Let's begin. Before he was Che, he was simply Ernesto. Born in Rosario, Argentina on June 14, 1928, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna came into the world prematurely and gasping for air. It was a metaphor for the rest of his life, every breath hard-earned, every victory snatched from the grip of struggle. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was a builder and businessman. His mother, Celia de la Serna, was fiercely intellectual and politically progressive, an early feminist, a reader of radical philosophy, and a teacher who played a more dominant role than most women in Argentina's patriarchal society. The Guevara household was no ordinary home. It overflowed with books, debate, and defiance. From an early age, young Ernesto was exposed to literature by Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Friedrich Engels. He didn't just skim them, he digested them. At age 10, he was already reading philosophy and keeping a personal journal to record and reflect on the ideas of great thinkers. Yet this wasn't an indoor intellectual. Despite suffering from chronic asthma and even pneumonia, he pushed himself into sports like rugby, swimming, and soccer. His willpower became his identity. One friend remembered him as someone who never accepted limits, not physical, not intellectual, not social. This resistance to limits became a defining trait. While most boys his age cared about popularity or clothes, Ernesto was consumed by ideas of freedom, of justice, of dignity. His asthma became less of a disease and more of a crucible. Instead of letting it define him, he declared war on it, often sleeping on cold floors, to ease his breathing, refusing pity and training harder than boys with healthy lungs. But it wasn't just willpower that shaped him, it was witnessing hypocrisy. In Argentina, he saw how the elite lived in grand homes while the poor struggled with basic needs. He heard intellectuals talk about ethics but saw none in how they treated their workers. These contradictions didn't sit well with him. He didn't just observe injustice, he began to internalize it. In high school, he stood out not because he was loud, but because he was serious. He was drawn to older university students debating politics and philosophy with a maturity that impressed even them. One incident stands out. When invited to a political protest, he refused unless given a gun. "What's the point of marching to get beaten by police?" he asked. "If we're going to fight, let's fight for real." That comment, brash as it may seem, captured his view of action. Symbolic gestures weren't enough. If something was worth dying for, then it had to be worth fighting for. And if you weren't willing to go all the way, why bother? This mindset would only grow more intense over time. By the time he entered medical school at the University of Buenos Aires in 1948, he had become obsessed with both the science of healing and the philosophy of suffering. Medicine wasn't just a career, it was a window into the human condition. He once wrote in his notes that disease was a social phenomenon with political causes. Even in science, he saw power and inequality at play, and that tension between healing and fighting, between compassion and confrontation, would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1951, at just 23 years old, Ernesto Guevara took a break from his medical studies and mounted an aging 500cc Norton motorcycle with his best friend Alberto Granado. Their goal was simple: see South America. What they didn't know was that the journey would transform both their futures and shift Guevara's soul forever. At first, the trip had the spirit of adventure. Two young men on the open road joking, eating poorly, sleeping wherever they could. The bike nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty One, was constantly breaking down. Eventually it gave out entirely. But by that point it didn't matter. The real engine of the journey wasn't mechanical, it was emotional. As they traveled through Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, Che came face to face with the other South America one he had only read about in theory. He saw the leper colonies in San Pablo, where people were abandoned by their governments and stigmatized by their communities. He met indigenous workers exploited in the mines of Chuquicamata. He watched hungry children beg for food while politicians gave speeches about progress. And for the first time, his medical knowledge wasn't enough. His hands could treat symptoms but not causes. A bandage couldn't fix injustice. A syringe couldn't cure systemic poverty. The journey opened a new wound in him, one that medicine alone couldn't close. One night, while lying under the stars in the Chilean desert, Guevara wrote in his journal that he felt divided. There was the Ernesto who cared about research and healing. But there was also a Che emerging from within who burned with rage at injustice and longed to do something far more radical. That internal shift became the foundation of a new worldview that poverty was not an accident but the result of deliberate systems of exploitation. He began to see capitalism, not illness, as the true epidemic. This wasn't just youthful angst. These were concrete observations written in vivid detail in what would later become the Motorcycle Diaries, a raw philosophical travel memoir that reads like a man discovering his mission in real time. By the end of the trip, Che was no longer just a doctor in training. He was a man in search of a revolution. But here's the irony for someone who would soon embrace violent struggle. He didn't come back waving a gun. He returned more certain of his convictions, but still unsure of how to act on them. What the journey gave him wasn't just outrage, it gave him purpose. And more importantly, it showed him that true change could never come from institutions. He saw this in the faces of the forgotten, the miners, the lepers, the peasants who had no lobbyists, no representation, and no future. And this is where Che differed from most armchair revolutionaries. He didn't just empathize, he embedded. He worked alongside laborers, treated patients in makeshift clinics, and walked thousands of miles across a continent to see truth for himself. But it also planted a dangerous seed, the belief that real change could only come through radical, violent upheaval. Peaceful reform, he'd seen too much to believe in it. As Che would later say, "A revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe. You have to make it fall." And with that, the doctor picked up a rifle. In early 1965, Che Guevara vanished. No public explanation, no farewell speech. One day he was a government official, the next a ghost. Behind closed doors, he had written a farewell letter to Fidel Castro, renouncing his positions, titles, and citizenship. He wrote, "Other nations of the world summon my modest efforts. I feel that I have fulfilled the part of my duty that tied me to the Cuban Revolution, and I bid you all farewell." Che didn't want comfort, he wanted war. He first traveled to the Congo, hoping to ignite an anti-imperialist revolution. But it was a disaster. The local fighters were disorganized, morale was low, and Guevara, an outsider with light skin and a foreign accent, couldn't inspire them. After months of failure, he retreated in silence, sick and disillusioned. Still, the dream didn't die. In 1966, Guevara slipped into Bolivia, disguised carrying a forged passport, determined to start another revolution, this time in the heart of South America. He believed Bolivia could become the next Cuba, a rural uprising that would spark flames across the continent. But Che had miscalculated badly. He underestimated the terrain. The local population, especially the indigenous communities, didn't trust him or his men. Unlike in Cuba, where the peasants had embraced the revolutionaries in Bolivia, the villagers often sided with the government, or simply stayed silent. His guerrilla group was small and disjointed, supplies were scarce, medical care was minimal. His asthma worsened. His men were hunted like animals by the Bolivian army, which was trained and funded by the CIA. Even worse, the Communist Party of Bolivia, who Che expected to support him, rejected him. They thought his plan was suicidal. They were right. Guevara's once razor-sharp strategies gave way to exhaustion and indecision. His forces were divided into small units, making them easier to track and isolate. And as the weeks dragged on, it became clear Che was no longer in control. Still, he wrote in his journal every day. Known today as the Bolivian Diaries, his entries are haunting. You can sense the deterioration, physical, emotional, strategic. Yet his belief never wavered. He knew death was likely, but he embraced it. "It is better to die standing," he once said, "than to live on your knees." That moment came on October 8, 1967. An informant revealed his location in the Ural Ravine. Nearly 2,000 Bolivian soldiers surrounded his camp. In the ensuing ambush, most of his men were killed. Che, wounded in the legs and unable to escape, shouted, "Do not shoot, I am Che Guevara. I am worth more to you alive than dead." He was captured, bound, and taken to a small schoolhouse in the nearby village of La Higuera. What happened next became legend. Soldiers came and went, unsure what to do. Journalists arrived, so did CIA agents. But Che refused to talk. He sat upright, even in chains, and stared straight into the eyes of his captors. A Bolivian schoolteacher named Julia Cortez was brought in. Che spoke to her not about politics, but about education. He pointed to the broken walls and said, "This school is where I fight." The next morning, orders came from Bolivia's president: Che Guevara must die. They didn't want a trial. They wanted silence. At 1:10 p.m. on October 9, 1967, a young soldier named Mario Terán entered the classroom, nervous and trembling. Che looked. "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You're only going to kill a man." The shots were deliberate, first the arms, then the legs, and finally the fatal one to the chest. Che Guevara died at age 39. But death didn't bury him. It birthed something else: myth. Che Guevara was not a simple man. He was both doctor and executioner, poet and warrior, idealist and authoritarian. To some, he is a saint of revolution, a man who gave up wealth and comfort to fight for the poor. To others, he is a violent radical who believed the ends justified even the darkest means. The truth is somewhere in between. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can justice be born from violence? Can revolution exist without repression? And is dying for a cause the highest form of integrity or the ultimate act of ego? Che Guevara's story didn't end in that Bolivian classroom. It began there, etched into walls, posters, protests, and history itself. He became not just a man, but a symbol. And the world is still arguing over what that symbol truly means.